You're listening to The Big Picture with Edwin Eisendrath on WCPT 820.
Ezra Levin is co-founder and co-executive director of the Indivisible Project. He came up with this powerful idea after leading policy work for a national nonprofit, leading its public policy work, directing the policy team for a congressman on the Hill, and spending time as a campaign field director. And as you guys listening know, these are all roles I deeply respect because you learn how our democracy works. He got a master's in public affairs from Princeton, but we won't count that against him because his undergrad work was at Carleton College in Minnesota. Ezra, welcome.
Edwin, great to be here. Great chatting.
Hey, you published a new Indivisible guide this week, and I want to talk with you about that and go through it. But first, I want to thank you. I mean, really thank you. What you guys unleashed at Indivisible is the civic energy of millions of Americans. We came out of our shells and started to work together again to build a stronger, more inclusive America. And I know we just suffered a huge political loss, but the experience of so many doing so much and doing it together is the stuff that builds a stronger civil society. And I want you and your team to know how grateful I am and others are for that, not only because it makes our community stronger, but because a stronger civil society is a very big inoculation against the kind of autocratic nonsense Mr. Trump and his crowd are attempting to dump on us. So thank you, Ezra. Really, thank you.
Well, I appreciate that, Edwin, and I'm proud of that Google Doc that we released 8 years ago, but really that was a Google Doc, and what made it real was normal, everyday people picking it up and putting it into action in their own communities. We are very clearly not the leader of this movement. The leaders are spread across every community. It's folks who raised their hand and said, I guess I've got to do something, and they started organizing.
Yeah, and you gave everybody the direction and kind of permission to not be afraid in a very frightening time and to go out and meet their neighbors and to do the kind of stuff that makes us stronger, even when we get our butts kicked, which I hope we will now stop doing. That's a really bad habit.
That's the goal.
So, yeah. Will you walk us through some of the why you thought we should do this again, this new guide, and what's different, and we'll go through it in a little bit of detail?
Yeah, sure thing. So the original Indivisible guide, Leah and I, my spouse, and I wrote that guide over Thanksgiving break because we saw two things happen within 24 hours of each other. One was an interview with a future Trump appointee. This is in late 2016, where he talked positively about the Japanese internment camps during World War II as an example of what we could do with Muslims, immigrants, and refugees. And the second thing we saw was an interview in the New York Times with incoming Senate Minority Leader Chuck Schumer, reflecting the opinion of many Democrats in Congress when he said, well, we lost, that happens. I guess we're just going to have to work with Trump and the other side on other things like infrastructure. And that really set us off because it seemed quite likely in late 2016 that the near-term future in America was going to be that we had well-paved roads to America's new internment camps, and it will all be paid for by bipartisan dollars. And we thought there was a different way. We thought it was actually possible to organize to say no. And it was clear to us that we did have allies in Congress. We had allies in leadership, but they needed to be pushed to become our allies. And the way to push them was to organize locally. I think there's a common misconception that politics at the national level is like House of Cards, that there's some puppet master pulling the strings. There are 7-layer plans that are all moving forward exactly as it was conceived. And the reality is politics is much more like Veep. It is a tragic comedy. It is folks, some of whom are well-meaning, some of whom are not well-meaning. They're all underpaid and overworked. They're trying to figure out how to get through the next crisis, and they're responding to pressures wherever they come from. And the question for which direction democracy goes is, are the pressures coming from the MAGAs? Are the pressures coming from the corporate interests? Or are the pressures coming from the people? And people organized can indeed apply pressure in many circumstances, either to stop bad stuff that's coming or to slow it down, which is meaningful because if you slow things down, less bad stuff happens, or to blunt the impact. And as a final resort, if you can't stop it, if you can't blunt the impact, if you can't slow it down, you can at least make sure that the folks who push forward unpopular policies take political damage and get defeated the next opportunity you can defeat them. That was the basic game plan with the original Indivisible Guide. It was entirely focused on Congress. We're former congressional staffers. That's what we focused on. The new guide reflects some of those lessons. Some of the things are the same, but we've got to recognize the world has changed. Trump 2.0 is different and scarier. And our source of power is not only our elected official at the federal level. It's not only our senator or representative. There are sources of power all over the country. There are 500,000 elected officials in this country at the local level, at the state level, at the federal level. So the new guide updates the strategic direction of that original guide and says, look, you might have a representative that you can push. You might have a senator you can push. You might have a state rep you can push. You might have a governor that you can push. You might have a city council person or a mayor. You should start locally. You should organize with a small group of folks locally, and then you should identify where is your leverage. And the guide attempts to lay out how to find that leverage and practical steps that you can take to get started.
Yeah, I want to go into some of those steps, but there's a lot to unpack in what you just said. Notably, I think you talked about, whether change comes from the lobbyists or from the people or from any other source, but progress in America has always come from, but that's not true. Political progress has always come from the people, social and political progress. I mean, we've had right. Technological progress, economic progress in other ways, but political progress only ever comes when we organize. I think about labor and what we've done to make that better in America. I think about civil rights. It never came from any place other than the people.
That's exactly right. I think another common misconception is that the purpose of political organizing is to elect leaders and then they fix everything for you. And as you said, that's never been the case. Wilson was an opponent of the suffragettes. They had to actually organize to push him. FDR did not immediately push for the New Deal program. He had to be pushed. LBJ had to be pushed by MLK in a powerful civil rights movement. Obama almost dropped the Affordable Care Act and had to be pushed. Each time we've had an opportunity to make progress because we've won majorities in Congress or the presidency, we've also had to push. And each time we've lost, we've also had to organize to prevent damage. That's how it goes. In a democratic republic, which is what we all live in a federated democratic republic where power is distributed across the entire country from the presidency on down to the local dog catcher, the way that you influence things is you organize your constituent power that you have, and you have that power by virtue of being a constituent, by virtue of where you live. There are people who depend on your vote to get reelected or grow their power, and that means they have to care what you think. That is the key fundamental tool we have. We use it sometimes to be a pain in the butt to our elected officials. That's called advocacy or accountability. And then we use it sometimes to replace those elected officials. That's called an election.
I have talked about this before, but I'm interested in your thoughts. I think for many years, progressives in America outsourced the work you're talking about, the essential work that we have to do to lawyers. We just said, the Supreme Court will protect all our rights. We'll make everything better. We can just litigate our way to the things we care about in our democracy. And we let this organizing muscle atrophy.
Yeah. I think that's a really important insight. I was part of the nonprofit industrial complex. I worked for a national nonprofit that did anti-poverty work. I thought it was good work, and it was good work. We made some good progress. But I was a paid think tanker advocate trying to create policies and convince members of Congress to listen to their better angels and throw a few more bucks towards their earned income tax credit or support for folks to put away a little bit of savings. That was my job. And when I was a staffer on Capitol Hill, I met with a ton of interest groups. Some of them were good, some of them were bad. They were all professionalized. The act of being engaged in democracy and pushing for good climate policy or pushing for good anti-poverty policy or pushing for better democracy policy, that came down to professionalized advocates and researchers based inside Washington, D.C. And I came to the conclusion after several years of doing that our problem in D.C. was not that we didn't have one new good white paper or we didn't have one new good coalition of nonprofits talking about what needed to be done. Our problem was we didn't have political power. We didn't have political power to actually get it done. A member of Congress didn't need another white paper. They needed a lot of their constituents saying, hey, you got to listen to us, otherwise we're going to throw you out of office. There's a great book on this. Asita Skocpol, who's a sociologist over at Harvard, wrote a book years and years ago called Diminished Democracy, which talks about how there's a rich history in America of civic clubs that organize, like the Eagles and the Elks and the Moose clubs. Some of them still exist, although they're just a shadow of their former selves. That used to be a major part of people's identities in this country. And over the course of the 20th century, we stopped treating people like actual individual actors in this democracy, and we started treating them like ATMs. We said, sign this petition, give us your email address and your cell phone number, and then give us money, give us money, give us money. Instead of, you got to organize. You got to actually own this yourself. One of my favorite things that I discovered over the history of Indivisible was Google searching the phrase indivisible logo in Google image search. And what you'll see if you do that, you'll see the National Indivisible logo. Look, we are a national nonprofit, but we're a movement organization. We exist to serve and work with these local indivisible groups on the ground. And these local indivisible groups, they are owned and operated and run by volunteers in their own community, which means if you search the Indivisible logo, you'll see tons of creative, locally made logos of the local indivisible groups, from Indivisible Austin to Tallahassee to Albany, and that's real. That is real organized power at the local level, rather than some sort of pristine, simple, top-down national operation. And I think that's why we are still here 8 years later.
Yeah. So before the Civil War, there was a movement called the Wide Awakes. And there's a great book on it. You know, it started, a couple people started this. They wore capes and played music, and they said, we should organize, you know, because we don't like what the slaveholders in the South are trying to do to the country. And it became the biggest national movement we've ever had. Crazy, right?
Look,
exactly what you're doing.
Some of our strongest indivisible groups that have become absolute powerhouses that command attention from their governors and their mayors and their elected representatives, they started by two people gathering in their living room after Donald Trump got elected and said, oh, my God, we've got to do something. Yeah. I think we can really overcomplicate this. That 98% of the indivisible groups are not incorporated. They are groups of friends and volunteers and colleagues who have built communities that meet on a weekly or biweekly or monthly basis, focus on their own local elected officials, and figure out what they can do. That's the model. It's got to be owned at the local level.
Yeah. The model, though, focuses primarily on our democracy itself, not so much on a bunch of policies that many of us would like the democracy to adopt. And that gets to the problem of winning. And I wonder, I'll get your thoughts on this. So we beat Donald Trump 4 years ago.
Yes.
And then we were, all of our energy and a year and a half of public angst, which hurt Democrats a lot, went into, you know, the Build Back Better fight, which led to remarkable legislation. But what we didn't do was strengthen the guardrails of democracy. I mean, I think I love what Joe Biden did, but I can't forgive the administration for saying the biggest risk to American democracy is Donald Trump coming back and then not doing what we needed to do to make sure that didn't happen.
Yeah, I a couple responses to that, both about directly to that and about the guide that we just released.
Yep.
I agree. Indivisible, as soon as we retook the House of Representatives in 2018, we started asking our groups, what's your top priority? What do you want to get done? Because we started by saying we just got to say no to Trump. We got to organize and create a united front saying no to the MAGA agenda. That's not a proactive agenda. And so we talked to the groups and asked them, and overwhelmingly, they care about everything. Look, this is a distributed grassroots movement. They care about climate and immigration and taxes, housing. But top of the list, very top of the list consistently was they were worried for democracy itself. So we made democracy reform our top priority from 2019 until 2022 when Kirsten Sinema and Joe Manchin sided with Mitch McConnell to kill the democracy bill. We ran a national campaign to get Democrats on board with reforming the filibuster. The first meeting I took with a presidential candidate was Senator Elizabeth Warren, who is beloved by the movement and an incredible leader, and was on our launch call a couple nights ago when we launched a new guide. Even back then, in 2019, Elizabeth Warren was not yet ready to come out for reforming the filibuster so we could get an up or down vote on democracy. So we had a long way to go. She became a leader, of course, in that fight. And by the time we ended it, it became a unified position in the Democratic Party that you got to reform the filibuster if you're going to get an up or down vote. What was not a unified position, as you said, was we need to prioritize holding Trump and his lackeys accountable for the crimes they committed on January 6th and prioritizing democracy reform to safeguard our republic. And as a result of that, I think you're exactly right. We did not deliver on the promise that Joe Biden made, which was a post-Trump era and a return to normalcy. By definition, if Donald Trump is running again successfully and capturing the Republican nomination, you failed at your primary promise to the public.
Yep.
And I do think we will look back at that post-January 6th period as a real missed opportunity because the Republican Party was at its weakest in terms of supporting Trump. You had McConnell and Lindsey Graham and others publicly creating distance. And instead of Merrick Garland pushing forward with prosecution, we had to wait nearly 4 years to get a sentencing date for some of his crimes. And as a result of that, he's not going to face consequences for his crimes, and the country is going to have a lot of damage done to it. That is all true. The second thing I want to say, though, is this guide is not the new indivisible guide that we released is not a guide to how we remake the Democratic Party or how we build a coalition that can permanently win in 2028 and beyond. It is much more narrow than that. I think those are important conversations to have. I think we need to figure out how we do a better job of building that coalition so it's not susceptible to the entreaties of an autocrat like Trump. And also, we've got to get to 2028 first. I'm worried about
I agree with you.
In Wisconsin in the spring, I'm worried about actually having free and fair elections headed into 2026. This guide is a guide to how we live to fight another day, which means across ideologies there are, non-MAGA Republicans and independents and progressives. We can all unify in this moment and say, look, I know we voted, the country, 49.9% voted for Donald Trump because they were upset about egg prices. What they did not vote for Donald Trump to do is to install Matt Gaetz as Attorney General. They didn't vote for Donald Trump to ban abortions. They didn't vote for Donald Trump for Project 2025. We can all join together and say no to that. And beyond this immediate period, we do need to figure out how we build a more durable majority coalition.
Yes, I'm with you on that. And I'm also with you that is tomorrow's conversation. That today, every day Donald Trump is announcing the worst cabinet in our history, the most dangerous, the least qualified, a cabinet designed to frighten us, I think, as much as to do anything else. And that's what they need in order to consolidate their power forever.
I would go a step further. I think it is a cabinet designed to dismantle the administrative state. You do not put in
that's right. That's right.
Clown shows like that with absolutely no qualifications and aggressive disdain for the very institutions that are set to run unless incompetence is part of the plan. They actively want to dismantle the administrative state, and we know that because that's a major plank of Project 2025.
Yes. And let's say that in a way, because some people have heard, because you and I probably won't spend today talking about the news and how that works, that ecosystem. But when they hear the administrative state, people say, well, why shouldn't that be dismantled? That sounds like a dumb thing. We don't vote for an administrative state. Right. So let's talk about that, because when you say the administrative state, you're actually talking about a competent government that does the things that Congress votes to tell them to do in the rule of law. Right. It's not some crazy thing that should be torn apart. And the alternative to an administrative state is what? Everybody works for the president, and it's a political state.
That's right. Look, do you want your Social Security check to go on out? Do you want your VA benefits to be administered? Do you want to be able to purchase something at the supermarket and trust that it's not going to get you crazy sick? We have an administrative state so that we're able to protect our people and make sure that they're able to live their lives safely.
Who wants to get on an airplane if the FAA isn't telling who can land at O'Hare?
It's scary stuff, and what we will see is that folks with a lot of money are going to be able to provide for themselves, and everybody else is not. And that is the goal of the folks who are backing Donald Trump. They see him as a vehicle for an extremist right-wing agenda that is not popular, to be clear. This is not popular.
Yeah, it's the goal of the billionaires who are backing Donald Trump. Right? The regular people who backed him, I think, are in for a terrible surprise.
It is terrible, and look, I don't wish this on anyone. I will say it gives us an opportunity, though, to build a coalition based on that backlash. Because people did not vote for what's coming, because they voted for lower egg prices, and they're not going to get that. They're going to get tariffs that increase their prices. There are going to be a set of people, obviously on our side, who voted against Trump, who aren't going to like this. There are going to be a lot of voters who did not vote who aren't going to like this. And there are going to be non-MAGA Republican voters, people who voted for Trump but didn't vote for this, who feel betrayed, who feel like this isn't what they were endorsing. They didn't like the status quo, but they weren't going for this. And that is an opportunity, if we take it, to harness backlash and make sure that they get as little done as they possibly can when it comes to damaging our democratic institutions and bringing harm to our communities. But also, we build into the elections in 2025 in Virginia and New Jersey, and the elections in 2026 in the midterms, with a majority coalition that can say fully together, no, we don't want this.
Yeah. Hey, in the guide, I don't have it in front of me. I think it was chapter 3. Maybe not, but you talked about the gap between the battleground and the non-battleground states. And I spent a lot of my time going door to door in Wisconsin, and we organized in Wisconsin, and we lost Wisconsin. But we lost Wisconsin a whole lot less than that movement in the rest of the country. So talk about how organizing works and how it makes a difference.
Gosh, it's such an important point, because I do think the enemy here, it's a mistake to believe that the enemy are the Republicans or MAGA or Donald Trump. They're not the enemy. They're the folks that we're trying to defeat. The enemy is cynicism, fatalism, defeatism, the sense that nothing I do matters, so I'm just going to focus on something else. And so, yes, in the first chapter of the guide, we try to create some shared understanding of what actually happened in this election. Because if we don't understand what happened in this election, we're not going to agree on what should happen next. And there are a couple of main takeaways, and you pointed to one. One is, if you look nationwide, there was a 7-point swing in non-battleground states against us, 7 points against us. That's really, really hard to overcome. But then if you look just at the battlegrounds, and Wisconsin is a great example because we did the best there, there was only a 1.5% swing in Wisconsin, which means where we were running campaign, where we were doing get out the vote, where we were knocking on doors and writing postcards and sending texts and making calls, we were able to close that gap by 5.5 points or 3 points. Significant gains in those areas. Now, that's cold comfort, right? We wanted to win. We didn't want to make gains. It mattered. You need to win the Electoral College votes to win the presidency. But it's a mistake to say that didn't matter. We would be looking at a Senate with 55, 56 or more Republican votes had we not done that work. We would be looking at North Carolina that had a Republican attorney general. We would be looking at abortion rights referenda that failed across the country. I know this loss is extremely painful because many, including myself, thought this was the most important election of our lifetimes and leads our country down a very dark path. But we need to be able to hold both that belief and an understanding that what we do can indeed make a difference. It's just the wave this year was really, really hard to overcome.
Yeah, terrible. I mean, and again, not this conversation, but sometime you and I are going to talk about the media ecosphere that contributes to that.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So you're right. Chapter 1, I'm sorry, you've refreshed my memory. Chapter 3
you're good.
was the plan to get through the next 2 years. And so let's talk about that. I mean, one of your points was play hardball, something that I have been very disappointed that the elected Democrats have not had the courage to do. So let's talk about how we give them that courage.
Yeah, so this gets to, I think, a key shift from the original Indivisible Guide, because the original Indivisible Guide was purely focused on members of Congress. It was how can you push your member of Congress? And remember, back then, even Republicans were unsure if Donald Trump really had the juice. They were unsure if he really could build majority support and was a political threat to them. That's not the Republican Party we have now. The Republican Party is entirely owned and operated by MAGA foot soldiers, which means if you live in a deep red district, there's a good chance your member of Congress doesn't care what you do. Organizing outside of their congressional district office is probably not going to change their behavior. But some of us have a Democratic member of Congress and can be pushed to do better. Some of us have a Republican or a Democrat in a swing district who can be pushed to do better. But many of us also live in a blue city where the Democrats control the city, or a blue state where the Democrats control the governorship and the state legislature. There's a big opportunity not just to play defense in Congress, but to play hardball in the states and the cities where we have power. Back in 2017, this is an amazing stat. I was shocked by this. I didn't realize it. Back in 2017, there were 6 Democratic trifectas all across the country. And by Democratic trifecta, I mean the governor was a Democrat and the state legislature was controlled by Democrats. Going into 2025, there are 15 Democratic trifectas, 15 states in this country that fully control the governorship and the state legislature. Those states have a huge opportunity to actually push back proactively, entrepreneurially against the coming attack on their communities and their residents. That's a big opportunity, but it's not a given. I will take an example that just happened literally yesterday that it's setting everybody's hair on fire. Jared Polis, who is the governor of Colorado, came out with this bear hug statement for RFK Jr. to be Secretary of Health and Human Services. That is the
irony of bear hug, by the way, not lost on me.
That is the behavior of an appeaser. That's the behavior of somebody who believes that the way to move forward as a Democrat is to cozy up to Donald Trump and make peace with Trump 2.0. That does not have to be the path that we take. Our Democratic governors and Democratic state legislatures ought to be fighting for us and ought to be drawing a very clear line in the sand that we're here and we're against Trump 2.0, and we're going to do everything possible, not just to protect our own residents, but do what we can to provide a safe haven for red state residents who are also under threat.
Yeah, I mean, my governor actually did something with Polis, and they said they were going to stand up.
Yes, he did.
And then did.
Yes, he
but
did.
JB has stood up. Yeah.
Well,
So
Pritzker, I'm more optimistic. Polis and Pritzker came out 2 days ago.
Yeah.
With great fanfare, with this coalition of Democratic governors to stand up for democracy. Looked really good, right? It makes for a good press release. Get some good media coverage. Literally the next day, Jared Polis comes out and says, well, I love RFK. He's going to be great. Something to that effect.
It's going to be terrible. You would think Donald Trump, after what he did to public health the first time he was president, he would care a little bit more the second time, but apparently not.
That's right. But this is why it is. Look, politicians love to talk the talk. They love to get positive headlines. That is the game, right? You try to take symbolic actions that can make your constituents think, oh, cool, he's one of the good ones. I know most of government doesn't work, but that Jared Polis really works for me. That's why you do a lot of what you do. But it is on us to make sure they're not just talking the talk, but they're walking the walk. So we need to not just trust that our leaders are going to lead in the right direction. We need to be looking over their shoulder and cheerleading them when they do, because that's equally important. But when they don't, we need to be in their ear saying, hey, we're watching you. We don't like this, and we're going to hold you accountable.
We have something else. It's not just optics and not just the fight, because if you look at the states where we were before this election, where the Republicans were in control through their gerrymandered legislatures, and you compare them. I mean, the best example is the contrast between Wisconsin again and Minnesota. They're practically the same state. They're neighbors. They share all kinds of things. But after the 2010 gerrymander, they went in different directions. Minnesota had the power to do things that Democrats wanted to do, and Republicans were in charge mostly in Wisconsin. And in those 10 years, their public outcomes diverged on everything from attracting private investment to the growth in incomes to educational attainment to health outcomes. They improved in Minnesota, and they did not in Wisconsin. You have a absolute laboratory of the difference in the outcomes in people's lives of the kind of government that we're talking about.
Yeah. I mean, the other thing that Wisconsin did is it would systematically break the back of the unions and gerrymander themselves more than just about any other state in the country, so that the Republicans could maintain control of the state legislature while getting by getting even a minority of the vote share. And I will praise the Wisconsin Democrats like Ben Wickler, who I would argue is the most effective Democratic Party chair in the country, and that might be light praise given the quality of Democratic Party chairs in the country. But he is actually quite effective and did a lot of work to organize in that state and to push back against the anti-democratic reforms that the Republican leaders had put in the previous decade or two.
They broke the gerrymander too. Which is something that Ohio had a chance to do this cycle and failed at.
That's right. It is worth remembering this is not the playing hardball is something that both parties can and have done in the past. If you'll recall, the Republicans who operated states under the Obama era actively refused free money for Medicaid, free money for health care for their residents for years and years and years. Now, I disagree with that. I think that's crazy. I think that obviously hurts their residents. It hurts the bottom line of their states. But they decided to pick a fight with the president that they disagreed with, and they did it. They did it. So we should remember, we are not powerless here. There is not one presidency that has all the power and can do everything. There are 50 state republics. There are 19,000 cities and towns and villages. And there are, like I said, 500,000 elected officials spread around there. If we use the power that we've got in those communities, we're not going to be able to stop everything, but we're going to be able to stop a lot.
Yeah, I mean, Governor Abbott in Texas has made a career out of saying, it doesn't matter what the federal government says. The federal government isn't even allowed near the border in parts of Texas because of him, right? We have a lot of power. And
look, when I was
go ahead.
I'm a Texan. I'm a Texan.
Yep.
I worked for the chair of the Texas Democratic delegation, Lloyd Doggett, who's still in office. He's a good old-fashioned progressive. He used to represent LBJ's old district. And when I worked for him, we got into fights with the Texas governor. We got into fights with how they were using federal funds, because what they would do is we would pass a law providing more funding for public education and send it to Texas. And the Texas governor would simply cut state funding for education and use that federal money that we're sending them for cutting taxes for the residents or the corporations. So it is quite common in American politics. It's not super well covered, but it's quite common to have that give and take, to have that push and pull between the feds and the states. And we've just got to play our part in the states now.
Yep. All right. Well, talk about some of the other things that people can do that you describe really well in the guide.
Well, and I want to be clear. This guide does not have all the answers. This guide does not try to be entirely comprehensive. What it tries to do is to present a comprehensive plan that can indeed stop, stall, or blunt the impact of some of the worst of what's coming at us, and systematically build towards a win over 25 and 26 so that we can hold on longer, so that we don't continue to face unified Republican control of Congress. So with all that said, we already covered a couple of the main planks. One, you can actually push your reps and your senators where they are pushable. If you've got their ear, you can push them to say no. And we saw that play out this week. There was a bill moving through Congress this week that was going to give Donald Trump more power. And it was going to give him specifically power to go after nonprofits that he disagreed with, label them terrorist organizations, and take away their status. It was wild that it was moving through with Democratic support, but it was. So this bill was going to move forward with bipartisan support. And we teamed up with the Congressional Progressive Caucus. They alerted us that, hey, this thing might actually move forward and pass. We put out the alarm. We drove thousands of calls to Democratic offices saying, hey, you need to not vote to increase Donald Trump's power. And you know what? They killed the bill. They were able to rally enough support. I'm not saying we're always going to win those fights, but we sure as hell ought to be fighting those fights. Where you have a Democratic member of Congress who you can push, or a squishy, non-MAGA Republican member of Congress who maybe doesn't want to get on the wrong side of their constituents, you ought to be throwing in on those fights. We talked about hardball at the state and local level. And the last plank of this strategy is we got to be real that election deniers and saboteurs won in a lot of swing states and districts across the country last week. Mm-hmm. That's scary, but it's not a foregone conclusion that they're therefore going to cut off our ability to have elections going forward. We need to get into the details and push back against their efforts at the local level. So where there are threats to our ability to hold elections, especially in these important swing districts and swing states, we got to dig into the details. We got to look over the shoulder of these new election administrators who have gotten in, and we've got to make sure that they're not pulling any stunts. They're not pulling any shenanigans that could endanger our ability to actually hold elections in 2026 and beyond. So those three top-level plays depend on where you live. Right. Maybe you have leverage over your member of Congress. Maybe you have leverage over your mayor. Maybe you have leverage over the election administrator that just got elected in your community. There are also a set of things that we can do wherever we live. We've got to recognize that a lot of folks are going to be targeted by this administration. We've heard Stephen Miller talk about raising a red state army to go into blue states and force them to implement a mass family deportation force. There's scary stuff on the horizon, and we shouldn't act as if that's not coming. Wherever you are, you can be showing up in support of those under threat, whether that's yourself and your family, your neighbors, or your community. That can be participating in community aid organizations. That can be, yes, fighting back with state and local legislation. That can just be as simple as telling stories about the horrific agenda that's being implemented and terrorizing your communities. And you just do that. It's not hard to do this. You get connected locally. You focus on what is tangible. You organize yourself so that you are helping the people that are under threat. It's something anybody can do, and that exists outside of the capital P politics of changing policy. This is about showing up in your own community. But all of this comes down to not just doing it yourself. You're not going to do it yourself. You've got to find your local group and organize with them to do it.
And this is now, the last couple minutes here has been solid counsel for the people who live in deep red states. Because as you said, they can protest all they want out in front of their congressman's office. Congressman actually doesn't care what people think. A MAGA congressman. That's not, they're not there to represent people. But they can make a huge difference in their community, and they can make a huge difference by being witnesses and telling the truth.
That is
right. Of not letting them do their worst in darkness.
That's right. Look, we start chapter 4 with a quote from Timothy Snyder. If folks are familiar with him, he's a historian of authoritarianism. There's a book he wrote years ago, shortly after Trump won the first time, on tyranny, a pretty practical book on what it looks like for a democracy to evolve into authoritarianism and how to proactively try to push back. He was interviewed shortly after Trump won last week, and the quote really stuck with me. He said, "They want you to be alone. Nobody is going to fix this alone. That's not how this works." It's very, very important that you not give in to their strategy, which is to make you feel alone and powerless. Because if you are alone, you are pretty powerless. But if you're banding together with folks who are rooted in your community, I'm not talking about online communities spread around the country. Those are great. I love them. That's fine. That can be part of your life. But it can't be the entirety of how you push back right now. You need people who live on your block or in your town or in your city to band together and say, okay, what can we do here right now? Who is under threat here right now? How can we support them here right now? You're not going to be able to save everybody. You're not going to be able to do everything. But if some of us play offense and some of us play defense and some of us do both, and we all do it in our own community, that ladders up to a nationwide strategy.
Yeah, I love it. I mean, to go back again to these wide awakes before the Civil War, they used to go to politicians' homes and demand they come out and give a talk and that they hit the points they want to hear right then. It was, it was in your face stuff, but it was powerful.
So there is some interesting need for tactical innovation. I think there was a book a few years ago called Twitter and Tear Gas, which was a look at how people are organizing in the age of social media and 21st century technology. And one of the main arguments this is Tefekci wrote the book. One of the main arguments that she made was any successful tactic that you implement, you'll see your opponents adapt to it, and it's going to lose its impact, and you've got to then figure out new tactics. So in 2017, when the Indivisible movement was getting started, we did a lot of town halls. We did a lot of showing up at congressional town halls, including Republican town halls. And one thing we found is it was really successful. We made them look ridiculous and out of touch. And then you know what they did? They stopped holding town halls. Of course they did. Yeah, they stopped holding town halls. They adapted their tactics. It's smart. That's, of course, what they did. And so then we had to adopt our tactics. And Indivisible groups started holding empty chair town halls where they would invite the member of Congress. They wouldn't show, but they'd also invite the press. They'd have 100 people out. They'd have a cardboard cutout of the member of Congress and ask him questions. Or my favorite, in Michigan, the Indivisible group there held an empty chair town hall where they brought a live chicken on stage to represent Dave Trott, the representative who was refusing to hold town halls. He ultimately defeated him in the next election. We also saw progressive members of Congress hold adopted district town halls that we worked with them on. So if the Republican in an adjacent district was refusing to show up, the progressive in the adjacent district would travel to their district and hold a town hall and say, well, I'm sorry that your member is not going to show up. I'm here to answer questions about what's going on. So my point here is not that the guide gives some ideas, some strategic and tactical ideas of what you can do locally. It's not everything. This movement and any effective movement, it's a guide. It's a guide. And it's literally, it is a Google Doc that you can copy, you can amend, you can change, you make it work for your local community, run with it. That you said something at the very beginning that folks need permission, or folks are looking for permission. And I do think one of the main value adds we can provide is to tell you no secret shadowy group of pro-democracy leaders are going to open up your door and whisper into your ear, now's the time. You now should lead. It's not going to happen. There's nobody that's going to do it. You're going to have to organize yourself. And so if you need a permission structure to do it, use this guide. There's your permission structure. Get a few friends together and get started.
All right. Before we go, Indivisible does other things as well. You have I think your strategy is divided into three organizational parts. Just give us a high-level look at that. You lobby Congress, you run media campaigns.
We do, but fundamentally, look, the reason why we are here 8 years later, the reason why we're still relevant, I'm proud of our strategies. Look, I'm proud of our advocacy campaigns. We did a big campaign effort this year called Neighbor to Neighbor, where instead of just doing traditional canvassing or writing postcards, we connected people to their neighbors who were squishy Democratic voters to make sure that they got to vote. We've done tests on it. It is twice as impactful as traditional canvassing. I like that work. But the beating heart of our work is the support of the groups on the ground. Our movement is made up of local, volunteer-led, indivisible groups who organize to do advocacy, to do community aid, to do elections work, and they're doing it on their own time. Our goal is to make them as strong as possible. We want more feeding into those groups. We want more of those groups around the country, and we want those groups supported to build leadership so that they're sustained over the coming months and years. So the primary thing that we do is to support these groups on the ground, that support them financially, that support them with trainings. We have organizers spread around the country who are your point of contact. If we are successful in this moment, we have an enormous wave of people who are lifting their head up and saying, what can I do? If we are successful in this moment, they are either finding their local indivisible group and getting involved, or they can't find a local indivisible group right now. So they're telling us, hey, I want to start one. How do I do that? And we help them do it.
Well, you got a great one here in Chicago, and they do remarkable
incredible one. Yes.
Yep. Yeah. So, it's an example of success. Well, that's where we got to end. We've run out of time. Thank you, really, for spending so much time with us here today, and Ezra, for all the work over these years in helping Americans come together to stand up for this democracy. And it's good for our politics, but it's good for our communities as well. Really, I'm so appreciative.
Well, Edwin, thank you for having me and having this conversation. I will say journalists get a lot of fire from both sides, but right now we need you more than ever. We need people telling the story of what is happening on the ground and what people can do to be part of the solution to make sure that our democracy survives. So thank you.
Thank you, Ezra. Take care.